On a quiet rural road under a bright midday sun, a black mother stood beside a lifeless car, her child close, her heart racing. There were no houses nearby, no passing help, just heat, silence, and the heavy feeling of being unseen. In moments like this, fear isn't loud, it's quiet. It asks whether help will come or pass by. Then a luxury car slowed down, not to judge, not to question, but to decide something that would change everything. What happened next wasn't about money. It was about humanity, dignity, and a choice that still echoes today. Before we go on, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're new here, subscribe to Stories of Racism and stay connected with us for daily powerful stories. Tomorrow, we've got something extra special for you. The woman on that quiet stretch of road had lived a life built on routines, responsibility, and quiet endurance. She was in her mid-30s, a black mother who measured her days not by ambition or luxury, but by what needed to be done next. Every morning began the same way, packing lunches, checking homework, tying loose shoelaces, and making sure her daughter stepped out the door feeling safe and prepared. There was no excess in her life, but there was structure, care, and determination. She worked steadily, the kind of job that didn't come with praise or protection, only expectations. She showed up on time, kept her head down, and did what was required because reliability was her shield in a world that often judged her before knowing her. Her old car, scratched and worn, was her lifeline. It carried her to work, to school pickups, to grocery stores miles apart. It wasn't dependable, but it was all she had, and she treated it like something precious. Her daughter, 10 years old, was at that age where questions came easily and answers still felt trustworthy. She noticed more than her mother realized: the looks in certain stores, the silence after polite greetings, the way her mother always stayed alert in public spaces. Still, she believed in safety. She believed that adults would help if something went wrong. That belief mattered more to her mother than anything else. That day had started normally. Errands to run, places to be, the sun high and unbothered in a cloudless sky. The road they took cut through farmland, long and open, bordered by fields that stretched endlessly in both directions. It was the kind of place people passed through without stopping, a place that felt calm but offered little comfort if something went wrong. When the car began to sputter, the mother noticed immediately. She tried to stay composed, hoping it was nothing serious. But within moments, the engine gave up completely. She pulled over carefully, her movements calm on the outside, urgent on the inside. The silence that followed was unsettling. No engines, no voices, just the sound of wind moving through crops and the heat pressing down. She stepped out, checked what she could, and already knew the truth. This wasn't a quick fix. For her daughter, it felt like an interruption. For the mother, it felt like exposure. She scanned the road instinctively, aware of how alone they were. Rural spaces carried their own risks, especially for someone who had learned through experience that help did not always come evenly. She reminded herself to breathe, to project calm, to protect her child from the weight of the moment. Minutes passed slowly. Each passing vehicle that didn't stop added another layer of uncertainty. She thought about how often people made assumptions before understanding circumstances, about how easily vulnerability could be misread, about how quickly a situation like this could turn from inconvenient to dangerous. She stayed close to her daughter, offering reassurance without words, keeping her body positioned between the road and the child. The sun continued its steady climb, indifferent to the quiet tension building on the roadside. Somewhere in the distance, a vehicle appeared, different from the others. Slower, deliberate. The mother noticed it immediately, not with relief but with caution. She had learned that not every stop was safe, and not every gesture came without conditions. What she couldn't know in that moment was that this approaching car carried a decision, one that would test assumptions, challenge fears, and quietly reveal something rare. This was only the beginning. And what happened next would turn an ordinary breakdown into a moment that neither of them would ever forget. The mother kept her posture steady, even as her thoughts raced ahead. She knew this stretch of road well enough to understand how rarely help arrived quickly. Cell service flickered in and out, unreliable at best. She tried anyway, stepping a short distance away to make a call, turning her body so her daughter wouldn't see the frustration on her face. The signal failed. She slipped the phone back into her pocket without comment, returning to her child with the same calm expression she had practiced for years. She had learned early that fear, once visible, invited problems. So she spoke softly, pointing out the open fields, turning the pause into something that looked like a break instead of a crisis. Her daughter listened, nodding, trusting. That trust weighed heavily. The mother understood that her child was watching not just what she did, but how she reacted, learning, even now, how to exist in moments of uncertainty. Cars passed by at a distance, their drivers barely slowing, some not even turning their heads. Each one reinforced a familiar lesson. Being seen did not always mean being acknowledged. The mother didn't take it personally anymore. Experience had taught her that silence was often easier for others than involvement. Still, she counted the minutes, aware of the sun, the isolation, and the vulnerability of standing still while the world moved on. She thought about the stories she had heard, breakdowns that led to accusations instead of assistance, moments where help came with suspicion rather than concern. She had never told her daughter those stories. There would be time for those lessons later. For now, her job was protection in every sense of the word. She positioned herself so that her body formed a barrier, subtle but intentional. She smiled when her daughter looked up, asked if she was hungry, reminded her they had water in the car. Small reassurances, necessary ones. Inside, she was calculating options, considering how long they could wait, wondering whether walking would be safer than standing still. None of the choices felt right. Then, from far down the road, a vehicle slowed more noticeably than the others. It didn't rush past. It didn't hesitate and then accelerate away. It adjusted its speed, steady and controlled, as if making a decision rather than reacting to chance. The mother noticed immediately. Her shoulders tensed, though her expression didn't change. She watched carefully as the car approached, noting details without staring. The way it stayed in its lane. The way it pulled over at a respectful distance instead of too close. She had learned to read these moments with precision. Safety often depended on it. Her daughter noticed too, tugging lightly at her sleeve, curiosity breaking through the boredom. The mother responded with a gentle nod, her eyes never leaving the vehicle. She reminded herself to stay neutral, to assess before trusting. Help, when it came, was not always what it seemed. The car came to a stop, engine still running. For a brief second, time felt suspended. The fields were quiet, the air still. The mother stood firm, rooted in place, ready to act if needed. This was the pause before something changed, the kind of pause life rarely warns you about. She didn't know who the driver was. She didn't know why he stopped. All she knew was that moments like this carried weight. They revealed who people were when no one else was watching. They tested assumptions, both hers and his. Whatever happened next would not just be about a broken car. It would be about how quickly dignity could be stripped away or quietly restored. And on that empty road under the open sky, the story was just beginning to take shape. The moment stretched longer than it should have. The car idled behind them, neither approaching nor leaving, and the uncertainty pressed in harder than the heat. The mother stood still, every instinct alert. She had learned that hesitation could be safer than reaction, that waiting, however uncomfortable, often revealed intention. Her daughter shifted beside her, sensing the change in the air even if she didn't understand it. Eventually, the driver stepped out. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if aware that sudden gestures could make things worse. The mother noticed everything, the distance he kept, the angle of his body, the way his eyes moved not just to her, but briefly to her child, then back again. This was not the careless curiosity she had come to expect from strangers. Still, experience had taught her that appearances alone were never enough. As the man approached, passing cars continued to move by, their presence strangely isolating. Each one felt like a reminder that help was selective, that attention was unevenly distributed. The mother felt the familiar tension rise in her chest. She had been in moments like this before, times when she needed help but had been met with suspicion instead. Times when asking for assistance meant risking judgment. She thought about how easily the situation could be misunderstood. A broken-down car, a black woman on a rural road, a child. Too often, stories like these ended not with compassion but with assumptions. She prepared herself mentally, steadying her breath, keeping her voice calm, her posture composed. She knew that how she appeared in the next few moments could shape everything that followed. The man took in the scene carefully. He didn't crowd her space. He didn't rush to conclusions. Still, the mother felt the weight of being observed, assessed, measured. This wasn't just about a vehicle failure anymore. It was about how quickly vulnerability could turn into scrutiny. Time passed in fragments. A glance at the car, a pause, a look down the empty road. The mother stayed close to her daughter, subtly positioning herself between the child and the stranger. Her mind replayed past experiences, moments when help had arrived wrapped in condescension, or when concern had been replaced by interrogation. She refused to let this moment become another lesson in disappointment. As attention turned to the car, the reality of the breakdown became clear. This wasn't something that could be fixed quickly. The mother knew it, and she suspected the man did too. That knowledge brought a new layer of tension. Long waits meant more exposure. More time meant more chances for the situation to escalate in ways she couldn't control. The road remained quiet, but the silence felt heavy now. The sun beat down, the fields unmoving, offering no shelter. The mother felt the pressure of being stuck, not just physically, but socially. She was dependent on someone else's goodwill, and history had taught her how fragile that could be. As minutes passed, another vehicle slowed in the distance, then continued on. The mother's stomach tightened. She wondered what those drivers saw when they looked at her, a person in need or a problem to avoid. She had learned not to expect fairness in those judgments, but that didn't make them easier to carry. Her daughter asked questions with her eyes, glancing back and forth, sensing the seriousness of the moment. The mother responded with quiet reassurance, offering water, adjusting her daughter's posture, keeping her grounded. Inside, she was calculating again. How long before the heat became dangerous? How long before frustration set in? How long before the situation drew unwanted attention? The man returned to his car briefly, and the mother's tension spiked. She watched closely, ready for anything. She had seen too many moments where help turned into authority, where concern transformed into control. The possibility lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. When he returned, the dynamic shifted again. There was movement now, calls being made, plans forming. But even this brought unease. The mother knew that outside help could mean delays, questions, and exposure to systems that had not always treated her kindly. Tow trucks didn't just bring solutions, they brought interactions, paperwork, explanations. Each step carried risk. As they waited, the mother became acutely aware of how differently time passed for her than for others. Every minute felt stretched, layered with memory and anticipation. She thought about how often black women were expected to endure quietly, to manage crises without complaint, to appear grateful even when help came late or incomplete. The sun shifted slightly, casting longer shadows. The road remained indifferent. The man stayed nearby, not hovering but present. That presence was both comforting and unsettling. She didn't yet know what it meant. Trust, she had learned, was built slowly or not at all. Another pause settled in, heavier than before. This was the moment where many stories turned, where misunderstandings hardened into consequences, where someone's patience ran out. The mother felt it keenly, that invisible threshold where fear and hope balanced uneasily. She wondered briefly whether this would become a story she warned her daughter about one day, or one she held onto as proof that something better was possible. She didn't allow herself to decide yet. The outcome was still unfolding. The road, the car, the waiting, it all seemed suspended, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And as the next step approached, one thing became clear. Whatever happened next would reveal more than intentions. It would expose assumptions, challenge expectations, and leave a mark that none of them could simply drive away from. The waiting began to feel endless. Heat pressed down harder, and the stillness of the fields amplified every small movement. The mother became aware of how exposed they were, not hidden by traffic or buildings, not absorbed into a crowd. Out here, there was nowhere to blend in, nowhere to disappear. Every passing glance carried weight. Every pause felt loaded with possibility. Another vehicle slowed briefly, its driver's head turning just long enough to register the scene before continuing on. The mother felt the familiar sting of dismissal. She had seen that look before, the quick assessment, the silent decision to keep moving. It reminded her that help was never guaranteed, especially when assumptions filled the gaps left by ignorance. She tightened her grip on her daughter's hand, grounding herself in the one thing she could control. Her thoughts drifted to other moments, times when she had stood in line too long while others were helped first, times when her concerns were questioned rather than addressed. None of those experiences had been dramatic on their own, but together they formed a pattern, a quiet accumulation of being overlooked, doubted, or misunderstood. Standing there now, that pattern felt close, almost tangible, as if it might repeat itself at any second. The man remained nearby, occupied but attentive. He kept a respectful distance, yet his presence altered the atmosphere. The mother couldn't ignore the contrast between how quickly people noticed him and how easily they passed her by. His car alone seemed to command attention, legitimacy. It was an uncomfortable reminder of how differently people were treated based on what they appeared to represent. Time stretched further. The mother's concern shifted from inconvenience to endurance. She checked her daughter's face, looking for signs of exhaustion or dehydration, adjusting her posture so the child could lean against her. She masked her own anxiety with calm gestures, aware that fear could travel quickly from parent to child. This wasn't just about getting off the road anymore. It was about shielding her daughter from learning, too early, how fragile safety could feel. The road's quiet was broken only by distant engines and the hum of insects. Each sound heightened her alertness. She felt caught between hope and caution, unable to fully relax, unwilling to fully brace for the worst. The uncertainty itself became the tension, an invisible force tightening with every passing minute. She wondered what others would say if they saw this moment later. Would they call it kindness? Would they question her choices? Would they rewrite the story in ways that stripped it of context? She had seen that happen too, how narratives changed depending on who told them, how easily blame could shift toward the most vulnerable person in the scene. As the minutes passed, the man checked the road again, then the phone, then the car. Each movement signaled progress, but also reminded her how dependent the situation was on decisions outside her control. She hated that feeling. Dependence had never felt safe. It demanded trust in systems and people that had not always earned it. Another wave of cars passed without stopping. The mother's frustration surfaced briefly, sharp and unwanted. She pushed it down. Anger, she knew, was often misunderstood when it came from someone like her. It was safer to remain composed, even when the situation felt unfair. Even when patience felt like another burden placed quietly on her shoulders. Her daughter shifted again, her curiosity now mixed with discomfort. The mother offered water, adjusted the child's hair, murmured reassurance without words. She kept her voice steady, her movements deliberate. Inside, questions multiplied. How long would this take? What if help did arrive? What if something went wrong before then? The sun climbed higher, casting harsher light across the road. Sweat formed along her neck, her back. She thought about how quickly a minor problem could escalate in isolation, how a simple breakdown could become a test of resilience, dignity, and trust. She felt that test pressing in on her now, demanding more patience than felt reasonable. The man glanced in her direction again, and for a brief moment their eyes met. There was no judgment there, no impatience, just acknowledgement. It surprised her. Not enough to relax completely, but enough to disrupt the narrative she had been preparing herself for. It introduced a new tension, the possibility that this moment might not follow the familiar script. Still, she didn't allow herself to hope too much. Hope, she had learned, could make disappointment sharper. She stayed grounded in the present, counting breaths, monitoring her surroundings, preparing for whatever the next development might bring. Then in the distance a shape appeared on the road, slow-moving, purposeful. The mother noticed it immediately. Her pulse quickened. This could be resolution or another complication. She straightened slightly, instinctively bracing for the next phase. The air felt charged now, as if the long wait had been leading to this single point. Whatever arrived next would push the situation forward, one way or another. And as the vehicle drew closer, the mother understood that the rising tension was about to break, revealing whether this roadside moment would become another lesson in injustice or something altogether different. The approaching vehicle slowed as it drew nearer, its presence altering the rhythm of the moment. The mother watched carefully, her body instinctively shifting again, protective and alert. She had learned that escalation didn't always come loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly, disguised as routine. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the reflexive readiness to explain herself before being asked, to justify her presence on a road she had every right to be on. As the vehicle passed, it did not stop. It continued on, disappearing into the distance, leaving behind a heavier silence than before. The mother exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders settling but not releasing. Each near miss reinforced the fragile nature of hope. Help seemed close enough to imagine, yet far enough to remain uncertain. The man remained steady, seemingly aware of how long the wait had become. He checked his phone again, then looked up the road, scanning for signs of movement. The mother noticed that he stayed present without intruding, a balance she rarely saw. Still, the longer this lasted, the more exposed she felt. Prolonged visibility had a way of inviting attention she didn't want. She thought about how differently this moment might be unfolding if circumstances were changed. If the road were closer to town, if the car were newer, if she looked like someone people expected to help. Those thoughts came uninvited, but they stayed. They always did. Experience had trained her to measure moments not just by what was happening, but by how easily they could turn. Her daughter leaned against her now, fatigue beginning to replace curiosity. The mother adjusted again, offering shade with her own body, checking the child's face for signs of distress. She whispered reassurances, her voice calm, steady, practiced. She refused to let this moment teach fear if she could help it. Childhood, she believed, should be protected for as long as possible, even when reality made that difficult. The road grew busier for a brief stretch, then quiet again. Each pattern shift reset her nerves. She felt caught in a loop of anticipation, every sound pulling her attention outward. The sense of being watched, by passing drivers, by circumstance itself, never fully left. It was a familiar sensation, one she had learned to live with but never truly ignore. The man took a few steps closer, still mindful of space. The mother registered the movement instantly, her posture firming without becoming defensive. She reminded herself to remain neutral, to allow the moment to reveal itself. Her mind replayed countless similar pauses from the past, moments where she had waited to see whether respect or suspicion would fill the silence. Time continued to stretch. The sun bore down, unrelenting. Sweat dampened her clothes and discomfort crept in, dull but persistent. She thought about endurance, not the dramatic kind but the quiet kind that demanded patience without recognition, the kind that expected resilience without offering relief. She noticed how easily others could walk away from situations like this, how they could pass through without absorbing the weight of uncertainty. For her, standing still carried meaning. It exposed vulnerability, demanded composure, and required trust in a world that had often failed to earn it. The man checked the road again, then nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself. The mother watched closely, searching for cues, preparing for the next development. She felt suspended between two outcomes, one familiar and disappointing, the other uncertain but promising. The space between those possibilities was where tension lived. Her thoughts drifted briefly to how this moment might be remembered, whether it would become another quiet story she carried alone, or something she shared later as proof that not every encounter ended the same way. She resisted the urge to decide too soon. Experience had taught her that conclusions came later, sometimes much later. A distant sound reached them again, louder this time, unmistakable in its approach. The mother's pulse quickened. She straightened fully now, bracing herself. This was no longer just waiting. This was the turning point she had been anticipating, whether she wanted it or not. As the sound grew closer, the road seemed to narrow, focusing all attention on what was about to arrive. The mother held her daughter a little closer, grounding herself in the weight and warmth of that connection. Whatever happened next would move the moment forward, toward resolution or deeper complication. And in that charged pause, with the sun high and the field silent, the truth became clear. This was no longer just about a stalled car on a rural road. It was about dignity under pressure, trust under strain, and whether compassion could interrupt a pattern that had repeated itself far too often. The sound grew clearer now, heavy, mechanical, unmistakable. The mother's instincts sharpened. She shifted her stance once more, placing her body fully between her daughter and the road, her hand resting lightly but firmly on the child's shoulder. She reminded herself to stay steady, to remain composed, to not let anticipation show as fear. Moments like this, she knew, demanded control even when control felt impossible. As the vehicle drew closer, it became clear that this was not immediate rescue nor sudden relief. It was another variable, another presence entering an already fragile situation. The mother felt the familiar frustration rise, tempered by restraint. Too many times, help arrived tangled in procedures, questions, and judgments. She prepared herself for scrutiny, for explanations she hadn't asked to give but had learned to offer anyway. The road felt narrower now, as if the world had contracted around them. The field stretched endlessly, yet provided no shelter. She could feel the heat radiating from the asphalt, the air thick and unmoving. Sweat trickled down her back, but she didn't shift or complain. Discomfort, like fear, was something she had learned to carry quietly. Her thoughts drifted again to how easily situations like this were misinterpreted. How often a need for help was mistaken for irresponsibility. How quickly people filled in gaps with assumptions rather than understanding. Standing there, she felt the weight of those possibilities pressing in, each one a reminder that vulnerability came at a cost. The man remained attentive, his posture calm, his movements measured. The mother noticed how he positioned himself, not looming, not retreating, simply present. It was a small detail, but it mattered. Still, she didn't allow herself to relax. Trust, she knew, wasn't built on gestures alone. It was built on consistency, on what followed next. Another pause settled in, heavier than before. The mother's patience was being tested not just by time, but by uncertainty. She checked her daughter again, brushing hair from her forehead, offering another quiet reassurance. The child leaned into her, seeking comfort without words. That simple trust strengthened the mother's resolve. Whatever happened, she would manage it. Passing vehicles continued to appear and disappear, each one a fleeting reminder that the world was moving on without them. The mother felt a subtle ache, not of envy, but of isolation. She wondered how many people noticed moments like this and chose not to see them. How often kindness was delayed by hesitation or lost to indifference. She thought briefly about leaving the road altogether, about walking toward the distant line of trees, about changing the situation through movement rather than waiting. But the risks were too great. She stayed where she was, grounded by necessity, aware that stillness was sometimes the safest option even when it felt powerless. The man checked the distance again, his attention divided between the road and the mother and child. She watched him carefully, searching for impatience, for frustration. She found none. Instead, there was a quiet focus, a sense of responsibility that didn't feel performative. It unsettled her, not because it felt unsafe, but because it challenged expectations she had built for self-preservation. Time dragged on, each minute stretching thin. The sun shifted slightly, shadows lengthening just enough to mark the passing of time. The mother felt fatigue creeping in, dull but persistent. She resisted it, staying alert, staying present. She had learned that exhaustion could invite mistakes. Her mind returned to the broader truth she rarely spoke aloud, that moments like this were rarely just moments. They were reflections of larger patterns, small stages where fairness, empathy, and bias played out in quiet ways. This roadside pause felt like one of those stages, stripped down and exposed. Then subtle movement signaled another change. The man adjusted his stance, his attention sharpening. The mother felt it immediately, her senses aligning with his. Something was approaching again, this time closer, more definite. She straightened, bracing for the next development. The air seemed to tighten, anticipation pulling everything into focus. This was the edge of the moment, the place where waiting gave way to action. The mother held her breath without realizing it, her grip on her daughter firm but gentle. Whatever arrived next would decide the direction of this story, whether it deepened the uncertainty she knew so well or disrupted it entirely. And as the sound grew louder, filling the quiet road, one truth became unavoidable. The tension had reached its peak, and the next step would reveal whether compassion would finally break through, or whether this moment would become another quiet lesson in endurance. The sound finally arrived in full, unmistakable force, heavy tires against asphalt, slowing deliberately, closer than anything before. The mother felt it before she fully processed it, a tightening in her chest that made her breath shallow. Her body reacted on instinct, stepping half a pace forward, placing herself squarely between her daughter and the road. This was no longer waiting. This was confrontation with the unknown. The vehicle pulled in behind them, larger than the others that had passed. It stopped with authority, its presence dominating the empty stretch of road. Dust settled slowly in the air. For a moment, no one moved. The silence that followed felt louder than any engine. The mother's mind raced. She had learned that moments like this could shift in seconds, from ordinary to irreversible. She stood still, shoulders back, face composed, even as her pulse hammered. She knew the rules she had never been formally taught but had lived by her entire life. Don't appear nervous, don't appear defiant, don't appear weak. Be calm, be respectful, be invisible if possible. Her daughter sensed the change immediately. The child pressed closer, fingers gripping fabric, eyes lifted in silent question. The mother didn't look down. She couldn't afford to. She focused forward, grounding herself in stillness, preparing for scrutiny. A door opened, then another. Movement unfolded slowly, deliberately. Figures stepped out, their presence shifting the balance of the moment. The mother felt the weight of being observed multiply, not just by one person now, but by many eyes measuring the scene. A broken-down car, a black woman, a child, a rural road. Each detail felt like evidence waiting to be interpreted. She had no control over the narrative forming in those first seconds. She knew how quickly assumptions could harden into conclusions. She had seen it before, in parking lots, stores, sidewalks, moments where no one asked what was happening, only decided. Her hands remained visible, her posture stayed neutral. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and restrained. She explained only what was necessary, no more, no less. She had learned that too much explanation could sound like guilt, too little could sound like defiance. The balance was razor-thin. Time distorted, seconds stretched. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the road itself were holding its breath. The mother could feel the sun burning the back of her neck, but she didn't move. Movement felt dangerous now, not physically but socially. Every shift could be misread. She became acutely aware of her surroundings, the distance to the fields, the lack of shade, the isolation. There were no witnesses who knew her, no one who could vouch for her intentions, her character, her story. She stood alone in a moment where being misunderstood carried consequences she had spent her life trying to avoid. Her daughter's breathing quickened. The mother sensed it instantly. She fought the urge to turn, to comfort her, knowing that even a small gesture could be scrutinized. Instead, she reached back slowly, deliberately, allowing her child's hand to rest against her arm. A silent promise: "Stay still. I'm here." The tension thickened as questions followed, not hostile but sharp, the kind that carried implication beneath their surface. "Where were you going? How long have you been here? Is this your car?" Each one felt heavier than it should have been. Each one reminded her that she was being evaluated, not assisted. She answered carefully, her words measured, her tone controlled. Inside, frustration flared, hot, immediate, but she forced it down. Anger had never been allowed to her. She knew how quickly it could be used against her, reframed as aggression instead of fear. She glanced briefly toward the man who had stopped earlier. He stood nearby, watching, silent. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In that glance, she felt something shift, not relief, not safety yet, but recognition. He had seen the wait. He had seen the stillness. He had seen how long this moment had stretched for her. The air felt tighter now, the situation perched on the edge of escalation or resolution. The mother sensed it, the moment where stories diverged, where one path led toward help and the other toward harm. She stood in that space, holding her breath, aware that her life and her daughter's understanding of the world could be altered by what happened next. And then something changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to make the moment tilt. The man took a step forward, and everything depended on what he would do next. The step was small, almost unnoticeable, but in a moment this fragile, it felt seismic. The man moved forward not with urgency, not with authority, but with intention. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush to take control. He simply placed himself into the space with calm certainty, as though the tension itself had called him forward. The mother felt it immediately, the shift. The air changed. The silence rearranged itself around his presence. He positioned himself slightly to the side, not in front of her, not behind her, but near enough to be seen without being imposing. It was a subtle choice, but one loaded with meaning. He wasn't claiming the moment. He wasn't dominating it. He was entering it. The mother's pulse thundered in her ears. She stayed perfectly still, her training, earned through years of lived experience, keeping her composed. She knew better than to assume safety too quickly, but she also knew when something rare was unfolding. This wasn't rescue yet. This was interruption. The man spoke calmly, his tone steady, measured, unmistakably grounded. He didn't speak about her. He spoke with clarity about the situation, about the car, about the weight, about the heat, about the child. He said what she had been holding inside her chest the entire time, without defensiveness, without accusation, without spectacle. And in doing so, he shifted the center of gravity. The questions stopped coming at her all at once. The attention redistributed. The weight she had been carrying alone, quietly, carefully, lifted just enough for her to breathe again. Not freely, not fully, but enough to remind her that she wasn't invisible anymore. She felt something unfamiliar stir beneath her control. Not relief, not yet. It was validation. The rare, fragile feeling of being seen accurately, not as a problem, not as a threat, not as a story waiting to be miswritten, but as a mother in a moment of need. The child sensed it too. Her grip loosened just slightly. Her breathing slowed. She leaned more fully into her mother, the tension in her small body easing in response to a shift she didn't yet have words for. Children knew when adults were finally listening. But the moment was still dangerous. Because interruption could turn into conflict, just as easily as it could turn into compassion. The mother understood that better than anyone. She watched closely as reactions rippled outward, the way postures adjusted, the way expressions tightened, then softened, the way attention moved from suspicion to assessment, from control to consideration. These were not dramatic changes, but they were critical ones. Still, nothing was guaranteed. The mother's mind raced again, but this time with a different calculation. Not just how to survive the moment, but how to protect its direction. She stayed calm. She stayed measured. She stayed rooted. She allowed the man's presence to hold space without leaning into it too heavily. Dependence, she knew, could be punished. Time stretched again, but differently now. Not heavy, charged. The sun burned overhead, but it felt less oppressive. The road remained empty, but it no longer felt indifferent. The situation hovered at a crossroads, balanced between becoming another story of quiet injustice or something else entirely. She felt anger rise then, sharp, sudden, unexpected. Not explosive, but deep. Anger at how close this moment had come to turning against her. Anger at how familiar that edge felt. Anger at how much restraint she had been required to summon just to exist safely in a situation that should never have been this complicated. She swallowed it down, not because it wasn't justified, but because she knew the cost of expressing it. That knowledge itself felt like injustice. The man spoke again, calm, unwavering. He clarified. He redirected. He named what was obvious but had gone unspoken for too long, that this was a simple problem, not a suspicious one. A mechanical failure, not a moral one. The effect was immediate. The tension didn't disappear, but it shifted. Hardened edges softened. The moment that had felt like a tightening noose began to feel like a knot being carefully untied. The mother's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding herself until that tiny release happened. But even now, she didn't trust it fully. Because she knew better. She had lived through moments that looked like relief and turned into regret. Moments where kindness appeared briefly before vanishing under scrutiny. Moments where hope surfaced just long enough to make disappointment sharper. So she waited. And in that waiting, she became acutely aware of what this moment meant beyond herself. How her daughter was watching, learning, absorbing. This wasn't just a breakdown on a road, it was a lesson unfolding in real time. A lesson about whether the world corrected itself when it mattered. A lesson about whether dignity could be restored once it had been quietly threatened. The road was no longer just a setting, it was a stage. And what happened next would decide what this moment became, not just for her, but for the child standing at her side. The air grew still again. And then a final decision loomed, one that would seal the meaning of everything that had happened so far. The mother lifted her chin slightly. Because whatever came next, this was the moment it would all be decided. The decision came quietly, but its weight was undeniable. The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform concern. He didn't turn the moment into something about himself. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He stayed, fully, intentionally, without conditions. He made it clear that he wasn't leaving until the situation was resolved. Not halfway, not symbolically, but completely. Not because he had to, because he chose to. The mother felt the shift ripple through her body before her mind could catch up. For the first time since the car had broken down, she allowed herself to stand without bracing for the next threat. Her posture softened, not in defeat, but in exhaustion finally meeting support. This was the moment she realized how close everything had come to going wrong. How thin the line had been. She thought about how easily the story could have ended differently. A misunderstanding, an assumption, a tone misread, a movement interpreted the wrong way. She had lived long enough to know how often those moments ended badly, not loudly, not always publicly, but permanently. Her hands trembled slightly now, the delayed reaction of adrenaline finally surfacing. She steadied them by resting one against her daughter's back. The child was calmer now, watching with wide eyes, absorbing every detail. This was no longer just her mother's moment, it was becoming part of her memory. The man made arrangements efficiently, deliberately. He didn't question her story. He didn't ask her to prove her worthiness of help. He treated the situation as exactly what it was, a family stranded on a road deserving of care without suspicion. That alone felt radical. As time passed, the atmosphere continued to change. What had once felt like scrutiny gave way to something closer to respect. The mother noticed it in the subtle ways, the loosening of posture, the absence of sharp glances, the way the space around her felt less hostile, less charged. But even in this shift, something lingered. The mother felt anger again, stronger this time. Not explosive, not reckless, but focused. Anger that this moment of decency felt so extraordinary. Anger that safety had required intervention. Anger that her calm had been mistaken for compliance, her restraint mistaken for acceptance. She understood now that the injustice wasn't just in what almost happened, but in how normal that risk had felt. She looked at her daughter and wondered what lesson this day would leave behind. Would the child remember the fear, the waiting, the vulnerability, or would she remember the interruption, the moment someone stepped in and changed the direction of the story? The mother hoped fiercely that it would be the latter. As the final pieces fell into place, the man turned to her, not with pride, not with expectation, but with quiet acknowledgement. No speeches, no declarations, just the shared understanding that something important had happened here, even if no one else ever heard about it. She met his gaze and nodded once. In that gesture was everything she didn't say. Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for staying. Thank you for choosing humanity when it mattered. The car would be repaired, transportation would be secured, the immediate problem would be solved. But what lingered was something deeper. Because this moment had exposed a truth that couldn't be ignored, that safety should not depend on who stops, who speaks, or who has the power to interrupt injustice. That dignity should not be conditional. That compassion should not be rare. As they prepared to leave that stretch of road behind, the mother felt the weight of the day settle into her bones. She was tired, not just from the heat, not just from the waiting, but from the lifetime of moments like this, where survival required restraint and hope had to be rationed. And yet something had shifted. Not enough to erase the past. Not enough to guarantee the future. But enough to remind her that patterns could be broken, sometimes quietly, sometimes unexpectedly. Her daughter looked up at her, eyes searching. The mother smiled then, not wide, not forced, but real. Because in a world that too often asked her to endure silently, someone had chosen to stand with her instead. And that choice, simple, deliberate, human, had changed everything. This wasn't just the end of a crisis. It was the moment the truth became impossible to ignore. That racism doesn't always shout. That injustice doesn't always announce itself. And that humanity, when it finally shows up, has the power to stop it in its tracks. The road fell silent again as they moved on. But the impact of what happened there would not fade. Because some moments don't end when the danger passes. They stay. They teach. They demand to be remembered. And this was one of them. The road eventually emptied, the field slipping past as the moment receded behind them. The car ride away from that lonely stretch of land was quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because some experiences demanded space before words could exist. The mother kept her eyes forward, hands steady on the wheel, her daughter seated beside her, calmer now, her small body finally at rest. But inside the mother, nothing was still. What had happened lingered beneath the surface, replaying in fragments. The waiting, the exposure, the way time had stretched when she felt most vulnerable, the way one decision, one human choice had shifted the direction of everything. She knew from experience that moments like this did not disappear once they ended. They settled. They rooted themselves deep. She had lived through countless situations where she had been required to remain composed under pressure, where dignity had meant silence, where survival meant restraint. This moment was different, not because danger had fully materialized, but because it had come close enough to be felt, close enough to remind her how fragile safety could be. As the distance between them and the road grew, the weight of what almost happened began to surface. The mother realized how easily the day could have ended with fear as the final lesson, how close her daughter had come to learning too early that the world was not always gentle or fair. That realization shook her more than anything else. She glanced at her child, studying the quiet focus on her face. Children absorbed moments differently. They didn't analyze them. They carried them. The mother wondered what meaning her daughter would attach to this day in the years ahead. Would she remember the fear of waiting or the presence of someone who chose to stay? That question mattered deeply, because the mother knew that racism often lived not just in dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of near misses, the moments that didn't explode into headlines but still left marks, the times when danger hovered close enough to be felt, when dignity had to be defended quietly, without witnesses or recognition. She thought about how many people experienced versions of this every day: breakdowns, stops, pauses, ordinary moments that turned extraordinary simply because of who they were. Moments where help was delayed, suspicion was quick, and compassion was conditional. This incident hadn't shattered her life. It hadn't left physical scars, but it had reaffirmed something she had always known: that safety was unevenly distributed, and that being calm, polite, and responsible did not guarantee protection. It only increased the chances of surviving the encounter intact. Yet alongside that truth, something else had emerged. A contradiction. Because for once someone had intervened, not out of obligation, not out of performance, but out of awareness. Someone had recognized the imbalance and chosen to correct it. That choice didn't erase the injustice of the moment, but it disrupted it. And disruption, she realized, mattered. Later that evening, as routines resumed and the day settled into memory, the mother found herself unusually quiet. She moved through familiar motions, preparing food, checking homework, tidying spaces, but her thoughts kept circling back, not to fear, to reflection. She realized she was exhausted in a way that sleep alone wouldn't fix. Not physically, emotionally. Tired of always preparing for the worst. Tired of rehearsing calm responses. Tired of carrying the responsibility of making the world feel safer for her child when the world itself often refused to cooperate. This moment had reminded her how heavy that responsibility truly was. And yet she also felt something unexpected. Not relief, but clarity. She understood now that moments like this were not isolated. They were part of a larger pattern, one that stretched far beyond her own life. A pattern shaped by history, reinforced by silence, and sustained by inaction. The road they had been stranded on wasn't unique. It existed everywhere, in neighborhoods, stores, schools, workplaces. The incident had ended, but its meaning was just beginning to unfold. Because the real impact of that day wasn't about the car, or the weight, or even the intervention. It was about what the moment revealed, and what it demanded next. In the days that followed, the moment refused to fade into the background of ordinary life. It returned unexpectedly, while washing dishes, while waiting in line, while listening to her daughter talk about school. It surfaced not as fear, but as awareness. A sharpened understanding of how close the world often came to tipping the wrong way, and how rarely those near tips were acknowledged. The mother found herself thinking about how many similar moments she had lived through without interruption. Times when she had stood alone, quietly calculating risks while pretending everything was fine. Times when she had been forced to choose composure over honesty, calm over emotion, because she knew how easily her feelings could be misread. Those memories lined up now, no longer isolated but connected, forming a pattern too clear to ignore. She realized that racism did not always announce itself with cruelty or violence. Often, it arrived as delay, as doubt, as the absence of help, as the expectation that she would manage, endure, and move on without complaint. It lived in the pauses where others felt no urgency, in the glances that passed over her without recognition, in the unspoken belief that her need was less legitimate, her fear less urgent. What had happened on that road forced her to confront how normalized that burden had become. She thought about how often black women were praised for strength, without anyone questioning why so much strength was required of them in the first place. How resilience was celebrated while vulnerability was quietly punished. Standing on that road, she had not wanted to be strong. She had wanted to be safe. And the fact that safety had felt conditional, that it had required intervention, was its own kind of injustice. She began to notice the world differently after that. Small interactions carried more weight. Who was helped first? Who was questioned? Who was trusted without explanation? She saw how systems, even when functioning as designed, often left people like her navigating uncertainty alone. The incident had not created this awareness, but it had sharpened it. And yet, there was also the memory of interruption. That mattered, because it reminded her that patterns, however deeply rooted, were not inevitable. That individuals still had the power to step in, to notice, to rebalance moments that leaned dangerously toward harm. That justice did not always arrive through institutions or policies. Sometimes it arrived through presence, through choice, through someone refusing to let silence decide the outcome. She thought about the man often, not with gratitude alone, but with reflection. His role in the story wasn't defined by wealth or status, but by timing and awareness. He had recognized the imbalance and acted without turning it into a performance. That distinction stayed with her. It challenged the idea that decency was rare because people were incapable. Perhaps, she thought, it was rare because people were distracted, uncomfortable, or unwilling to intervene. That realization unsettled her, because it meant the problem wasn't only ignorance, it was indifference. She wondered how many people had driven past that day, noticed the scene, and decided it wasn't their responsibility. How many times she herself had seen others in moments of quiet need and hesitated, unsure whether stepping in would matter. The incident became a mirror, reflecting not just what had happened to her, but what happened around her every day. At night, when the house was quiet, she thought about her daughter again, about what kind of world she was inheriting, about the lessons she would absorb, not from speeches or warnings, but from lived experience. The mother knew she couldn't shield her child from every injustice, but she could help her understand it. She could name it, and she could show her that moments of fear were not the end of the story. She spoke differently to her daughter after that, not with alarm but with honesty, about awareness, about dignity, about the importance of paying attention, not just to danger but to opportunity. The opportunity to be the person who interrupts harm instead of walking past it. The mother also recognized something else, quieter but profound, that her own survival strategies, while necessary, had come at a cost. Years of self-monitoring, years of emotional restraint, years of navigating spaces where she felt tolerated rather than welcomed. The roadside incident didn't create those habits, but it illuminated them. And it left her asking questions she had learned to suppress. Why should safety require so much effort? Why should calm be mistaken for compliance? Why should help feel like a privilege instead of a right? These were not new questions, but now they demanded answers. She understood that her story was not unique, that it echoed in countless lives across the country. Different roads, different faces, same underlying tension. The world often framed racism as rare or extreme, but she knew better. It lived in ordinary moments where outcomes hinged on who noticed and who didn't. The incident had ended without tragedy, but that didn't make it harmless. It had revealed how close injustice often hovered, how easily it could become reality without intervention. And that knowledge stayed with her, reshaping how she moved through the world. This wasn't just a personal reflection anymore. It was a reckoning. Because the question was no longer whether racism existed in moments like this. The question was how many times it went unchallenged, and whether enough people were willing to do what that man had done: pause, see clearly, and step forward. Before the next moment tipped the wrong way, time did what it always did. It moved forward. Weeks passed, then months. The roadside incident slowly shifted from something immediate into something remembered, but not forgotten. The mother returned to her routines, her responsibilities, her steady rhythm of providing and protecting. On the surface, life looked unchanged, but beneath that surface, something had settled differently. She noticed it in herself first. She was still cautious, still aware, still prepared, but there was a subtle difference now, a quiet refusal to accept invisibility as normal. The moment on the road had not made her fearless, but it had reminded her that fear did not have to be faced alone, that isolation was not inevitable, that silence did not always have to win. She began to trust her instincts in a new way, not just the instinct to protect, but the instinct to name what felt wrong. She allowed herself to acknowledge moments of unfairness instead of immediately minimizing them, not because she expected instant justice, but because recognition itself was a form of resistance. Her daughter changed too. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in the small ways that mattered most. She asked more questions. She noticed more. She paid attention to who was helped and who was ignored. And when she talked about that day, she didn't describe it as frightening. She described it as confusing, and then as something that turned out okay because someone paid attention. That distinction mattered. Because what children learn from moments like this isn't just what happened, but what could happen. The mother realized that this was how cycles shifted, not all at once, not loudly, but through moments that planted new expectations, new possibilities, new standards for what should be normal. She understood now that racism didn't only wound through overt cruelty. It exhausted through repetition, through constant vigilance, through the quiet burden of having to anticipate danger before it appeared. And she also understood that the most powerful challenge to that system wasn't just anger, it was interruption. Someone choosing not to look away. Someone choosing not to stay silent. Someone choosing to recognize humanity before assumptions. That day on the road had ended without sirens, without headlines, without consequences anyone else would ever record. And yet, it mattered deeply, because it revealed how close injustice often comes to completing its work, and how little it sometimes takes to stop it. Not money, not authority, not perfection, just awareness, just presence, just a decision. The mother carried that understanding with her now. She shared it quietly, intentionally, with friends, with family, with her child. She didn't frame herself as a victim. She framed herself as a witness to a system that still needed to change, and to a moment that proved change was possible. She knew that many people would watch this story and think, at least it ended well. And it did. But she also knew that focusing only on the ending missed the truth of what came before it. Because the real question was never whether help arrived in the end. The real question was why it had taken so long. Why safety had felt uncertain. Why dignity had depended on intervention. And how many similar moments never reached a turning point at all. This story wasn't just about a broken-down car or a rural road. It was about the millions of quiet tests that happen every day, moments where someone is left waiting, wondering if they will be seen accurately, treated fairly, protected equally. Moments where racism doesn't shout, but waits. The mother made peace with what she could not control, but she refused to forget what the moment demanded. That remembering was part of responsibility. That sharing was part of change. That silence only benefited the systems that allowed inequality to persist. And so the story ends here, but its meaning does not. Because the next time you pass someone standing alone, The next time you witness uncertainty, delay, or discomfort. The next time you feel that brief hesitation, the one that asks whether it's your place to step in. Remember this road. Remember this moment. Remember how close injustice came. And ask yourself, will you keep moving, or will you be the reason the story turns out differently? If this story moved you, share it, talk about it, reflect on it. Because awareness is where change begins, and humanity only survives when we choose it.